Hello, and thank you for being here at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. My name is Dr. Kirk Fitzhugh. I'm one of the curators here at the museum, and today I would like to give you a virtual tour of one of our collections here at the museum. This will be a group of animals that most people don't even know exist, yet you will find them throughout all the world's oceans, and they are one of the most important ecological players in all marine habitats. So this will be a unique opportunity for you to learn about a very interesting group of animals. So come downstairs with me and we'll start our tour in the collection room. We're now entering one of the collection rooms here at the Natural History Museum. This room is over 4,000 square feet and contains mainly marine organisms. And most of this collection in this room are a particular group of marine organisms that I'll be talking about today in this virtual tour. This collection is one of the largest in the world, and we have the most extensive holdings, especially of Eastern Pacific species, but we also have specimens of other species from all over the world. The collection is used for research purposes not only by curatorial staff within the museum, but also we have numerous visitors from around the world who come to conduct research using the specimens we hold here. And we also send specimens out on loan so that other people around the world can study specimens as part of their research also. So next, we'll start looking a little bit more specifically at what these animals look like that we have in this room. The animals that we'll be looking at in our tour today are known as polychaetes. Polychaetes are segmented worms that you can find in all the world's oceans. There are over 10,000 species that are known, and you will find them in every conceivable habitat in the world's oceans. They have an amazing array of body sizes and shapes, and in some cases, you would never even know that you were looking at a sea worm. Now, when we talk about segmented worms, you're probably more familiar with segmented worms such as earthworms, which you can find in your garden, and there are some species that are freshwater as well as marine. And another closely related group of segmented worms are leeches, which you're familiar with because they are commonly known as being parasites, but some are also predatory. Leeches also occur in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine habitats. So polychaetes are the third group of segmented worms. So you have polychaetes, earthworms, and leeches. These comprise the segmented worms, also known as annelids. These are very different from other types of worms, such as flatworms or roundworms. Flatworms and roundworms have a very, very different body construction. Their bodies are not composed of a series of segments. The word polychaete comes from two Latin words. Poly means many, and chaete means hair or bristle. And on this specimen, you can see the numerous bristles coming out from each of the body segments. This specimen actually lives in deep water in Antarctica. These long bristles are very effective in that they facilitate the ability of the worm to crawl over the sea floor, and for some species, the bristles are very useful for helping the worms to burrow into sand or mud, or to live in tubes that they construct for protection. And we'll talk a little bit more about tubes in just a little bit. One of the amazing things about polychaetes is that they have an incredible array of shapes and sizes, but most polychaetes actually are very, very small. In fact, most of the time when we conduct research on them, we need to look at them using microscopes. And it's this small size that's the reason why most people actually don't even realize that polychaetes exist and are not aware of how important they are in every marine ecosystem. Many of the preserved specimens that I'm showing you today, they lose their color once they are preserved. But when they're alive, a lot of polychaetes have very, very beautiful colors. These are some color photographs I'm showing you here. These were taken by our collection manager, Leslie Harris, who does some amazing photography of live polychaetes. But you can see it gives you a good idea of the variety of shapes and sizes that these come in. So they're a very successful group because they have the ability to adapt to so many different habitats in all the world's oceans. Next, let's consider what polychaetes eat to stay alive. When we consider the diet of polychaetes, many species which live in the sand or the mud actually consume that surrounding sediment much in the way that earthworms do. The worms will consume the sand or the mud, it will pass through the gut, and the worms will then digest the bacteria and organic material as a source of nutrition. Again, just like earthworms. Now, there are also many polychaete species, rather than feeding on the sediment, actually are predatory. They seek out and consume other worms, other polychaetes, as well as small crustaceans and other small marine organisms. If you're a predatory polychaete, you have to have a way of capturing your prey. And the most common approach that is taken is that many predatory polychaetes have pairs of jaws that they can use to grasp their prey and pull them into the mouth. I have a couple of specimens here that give good examples of predatory polychaetes. This specimen right here is known as a clam worm or sandworm. One thing I'll point out is, again, you can see the segmented body, and if you were to look closely, you can actually see the bristles coming out from each of those segments, again, giving the name polychaete. There are also these fleshy appendages coming out from each of the segments as well. These also facilitate movement by the worm over the seafloor or within the sand or mud. And they also serve as gills for gas exchange. And if you look up here at the head region, you'll see this individual has two pair of eyes on the head, and you can also see these sensory appendages like little tentacles. Now, right below the head, you're seeing the front part of the gut that extends out of the mouth, and at the end of that, you see a pair of jaws, very sharp. This extension of the gut out of the mouth is known as the proboscis. Now, when these sandworms come upon prey, they can very quickly extend that proboscis out, grasp the prey with those jaws, and pull it back into the mouth. Very, very effective predators. There's another interesting predatory polychaete. These are known as bloodworms. The common name comes from the fact that when these are alive, they have a very pink or reddish body color, and that's due to the fact that they have a type of blood pigment very similar to that of humans. The bloodworms are also predatory. They live in burrows and they sit and wait for something to crawl by, and they can sense the vibration of potential prey. In the bloodworms, the proboscis can be quite long. This is it right here, extending out of the mouth. The head is very small up here. Rather than having only one pair of jaws, bloodworms have two pair of jaws that you can see right here. What is interesting is that bloodworms are the only polychaetes that are known to be venomous. Each of these jaws has a separate venom gland associated with it. So when those jaws come into contact with the prey item, venom is excreted and used to incapacitate the prey. This proboscis withdraws and pulling the prey into the mouth. Bloodworms are commonly used for fish bait for saltwater fishing, and in some cases fishermen do get bit by these jaws, and if you're sensitive to things like bee stings, they can actually cause a little bit of swelling at the point that the jaws penetrate the skin. So the bloodworms are the only predatory polychaetes that are known to be venomous. Next, let's look at an interesting group of polychaetes that they're not predatory, but they do collect particles on the sea floor as food, but they don't consume the sand or the mud that they live in. So we'll look at that next. When talking about feeding among polychaetes, I mentioned earlier that there are many species that feed much in the way that earthworms do, where the worms are living in sand or mud and they simply take in that sand or mud and pass it through the gut, digesting the organic material from the sand or mud grains. There's another slight variation on that process of feeding that we can see in some polychaetes that is a little bit different, and I wanted to give you a nice example with a specimen similar to that right here. This is known as a spaghetti worm or Medusa worm. These, again, you can find all around the world. When these are alive, they can actually be quite beautiful. In some cases, very colorfully pigmented. Here, the red you see here near the head region, those are the gills. And then here you see the segmented body. And you also see a group of tentacles coming out. And here you can see them in this photograph right here. In this preserved specimen, here you can see the tentacles. Here you see the segmented body. There are bristles on here. They're just very, very short. When spaghetti worms are alive, they have a very, very soft body and they're largely helpless. They live in a tube that they make for themselves as protection, and commonly they'll either live in burrows or under rocks. Now, when they want to feed, what they will do is they will extend these tentacles out over the sea floor. In some cases, they can extend these out for 1 or 2 feet. Each of these tentacles has microscopic hairs on them that are moving together, and these tentacles will pick up little bits and pieces from the sea floor. Those microscopic hairs on the tentacles will then convey the food particles or potential food particles all the way back to the mouth, up on the head region of the worm. The worm can then sort through those particles and decide if it's going to eat any of them, any of the particles, or in some cases they will use those particles and glue them together to form their tube. And we'll talk a little bit more about tubes later on in this tour. The spaghetti worms, as I said, are quite soft and really quite helpless when they're alive. So being able to remain hidden and only sending out these tentacles is a good way to protect the rest of the body. If one of the tentacles gets bitten off, the worm can just simply regenerate or regrow new tentacles. So if you were snorkeling or diving, you might see what almost looks like pasta or spaghetti extending out over the sea floor. But most people would never know that what you're actually looking at are only the tentacles coming out from the mouth of a segmented worm or polychaete. Another type of feeding mechanism used by some polychaetes is where they filter particles out of the water column and use those particles as a food source. The polychaetes that I'm showing you here, these are known as fan worms or featherduster worms. These are very unusual because on the head region, they have a series of tentacles. These are also known, are sometimes known collectively as a branchial crown. And you'll notice that on each of these tentacles, there are then little branches of tentacles coming off. Each of these sets of tentacles has thousands of microscopic hairs that move in unison, and they actually can create a water current that causes the water to flow through the branchial crown. And if there are particles within the water, those particles can be collected by the tentacles, and using those microscopic hairs, those particles can be conveyed down to the head end of the worm down here, and where the worm can either eat those particles, or in some cases they will use those particles to help to construct their tubes. These are worms that spend their entire life living in a tube for protection. And once again, in addition to the branchial crown on the head, you can see the remainder of the body is segmented, and these are the bristles on here. They're very, very short, and they will also occur along the body. The very short bristles are very good because they act almost like anchors to hold the worm in its tube, and the tube provides very good protection. The specimen that you're seeing here is the branchial crown, those feeding tentacles, and then you'll see the remainder of the body. This is what is usually down in the tube, so you won't be able to see that when the worm is alive. Again, you see the segmented body. The bristles are very, very short. They function almost like little anchors to hold the worm in its tube. In this specimen right here, this is the tube that was made by the worm. This tube is interesting because it's actually constructed of nothing but the mucus that is secreted by the worm. On the worm's body, there are tissues that are specialized for secreting mucus. When that mucus comes into contact with seawater, it hardens, and that forms a tube that the worm will spend its life living in, and it provides very good protection. Now, what is interesting is that for featherduster worms or fan worms, sometimes this branchial crown can get bitten off by a predator, but it's no problem. The worm will continue living in its tube, and over time it will then regenerate or regrow a new branchial crown and can then resume feeding. I'll also point out, you see these little fuzzy things on the tube. Those are actually other organisms, other marine organisms. These are known as hydroids. They're actually relatives of jellyfish or corals. So the tubes that polychaetes make, while they provide very good protection for the worm, in some cases these tubes also provide habitats for other marine organisms. And here again, in this photograph, you see the tube, and here you can see the crown of tentacles extending out for feeding. Next, let's talk a little bit more about the tubes that polychaetes make for protection. I've mentioned earlier that you can find polychaetes in every conceivable habitat in the world's oceans. That means that polychaetes are some of the most numerous organisms found on the sea floor. And as a consequence, polychaetes are very, very important food sources for bottom fishes and various crustaceans and other marine organisms. Now, if you're a soft-bodied worm, it does help if you have a way of protecting yourself from predators. And one of the ways that many polychaetes have protection for themselves is that they construct tubes. Much in the way that we live in houses that provide us with protection, various species of polychaetes actually do construct their houses for themselves for protection. These houses are in the form of tubes. Depending on where polychaetes live, that will usually determine what type of tubes they make. In this jar right here, these are deep sea polychaetes. These were collected from several thousand feet deep in the Pacific. And you'll notice that the tubes in here, they're constructed of very, very fine mud, because this was the habitat that these worms were living in. Each of these, within this jar, each of these tubes contains an individual worm. In addition to soft sediment, many polychaetes will actually use sand or shell particles to construct their tubes. This specimen right here in this jar, the specimen itself is about 8 inches long, and what you see in here is a very long tube, over a foot long, that was constructed by this specimen. The specimen was living in sediment that has very large sand and shell particles, so the worm can pick up individual sand and shell material, and when it secretes the mucus, it will use that mucus almost like a glue to glue these sand and shell particles together to form its tube. And once again, it provides very good protection. There is another type of polychaete that's very unusual. These are known as quill worms. These are quite common in the deep sea. They're called quill worms because the tubes, which you can see here, and you can also see the individual worms still in these tubes. This is a gallon jar right here. These tubes are interesting because they don't have any sediment, no sand or shell particles or mud particles attached to the tube. The tube itself is nothing but mucus that is secreted by each individual worm. The reason these are called quill worms is because these tubes are really hard and they have the appearance of the quill of a feather. So if you were to pick one of these up and squeeze it, you'd find it's almost like really hard plastic. It provides a great source of protection for the worms. What's also interesting about quill worms is that these live quite commonly in the deep sea, but these tubes are not buried in the sediment. Instead, the worm lays flat on the sea floor and it pulls itself along with its tube. These are in many ways like deep sea janitors. They crawl around looking for a fish or any other organism that dies and sinks to the bottom. And these are polychaetes. These have 5 pairs of jaws, and they can use those jaws to rasp away at the flesh of any animal that died and sank to the bottom of the sea floor. One of the reasons we have gallon jars of these specimens is because when nets were dragged over the sea floor, they would pick up hundreds of these because these quill worms are simply lying flat on the seafloor, crawling around. So this is a very interesting way of forming a tube for protection. Another polychaete that is common in Southern California is what's known as a honeycomb worm. You can find these in rocky areas and rocky intertidal areas in Southern California, and the tubes are constructed of sand grains. So each opening that you see here would house an individual worm. And honeycomb worms can actually form rather massive colonies. If you get a good low tide around Palos Verdes in that region and look among the rocks, and quite commonly you can find these honeycomb worms. And you can see the individual sand grains here. The worms secrete mucus and glue the sand together. These are usually in areas with a lot of wave action that suspends the sand grains. The worms can collect those sand grains, attach them to their tube. And these colonies of tubes are very, very hard. They're very effective at bringing sand together. And again, these also provide habitats for other marine organisms. This is just a nice photograph right here. You can see the individual worms. This is during a high tide. They extend their tentacles out of their tubes. They use those tentacles to filter out particles from the seawater as a food source, but they can also use those tentacles to collect sand grains to add to their tubes. And here you can see a colony. Here's an individual right here. You can see the sand grains and the tentacles extending out. And finally, there are some polychaetes that can secrete calcium carbonate, almost like chalk, to form their tubes. This is a common polychaete here that you can find if you get a good low tide. This almost looks like a coral, but it actually isn't. Each of these openings that you see here are the individual tubes where you would have each worm living. When the worms are larvae, they are floating in the water and they can detect the presence of these tubes, and the larval worms will then settle along the edges and add to this tube structure or this colony. Also, again, these masses of tubes provide really good habitats for other organisms as well. You can see some barnacles here, and in fact, you'll see other tube worms attaching their tubes onto this colony of tubes. And again, these are calcium carbonate, so this forms a very hard structure and provides really great protection for the worms. I've talked a little bit about how polychaetes protect themselves by burrowing down into the sand or mud on the sea floor, and how some polychaetes have protection by forming tubes that they live in so that they can be protected from potential predators. There is one group of polychaetes that are also interesting because they have a defense mechanism that's a little bit different. These are polychaetes that are known as fireworms. And in fact, this is a group that you would want to be careful of if you are out snorkeling or diving. The word fireworm is actually very descriptive because it refers to the fact that these worms are considered in many ways as being poisonous. Now, in this photograph right here, notice that the worm has a very bright color, and you'll notice as well that the bristles on each of the segments, these bristles are very bright white and they're very dense. I have some preserved specimens here. They've lost their color, but again, you'll notice you can see the very dense bristles on the body. What is interesting about fireworms is that these bristles are not the same composition as you see in other polychaetes. The bristles in other polychaetes are more like your fingernails. They're stiff, but they can bend. In the fireworms, however, these bristles are actually made of calcium phosphate, much of the same composition as your bones. So these bristles are actually like little glass rods, and this actually provides very good protection for these polychaetes. For example, if you were out snorkeling and you were to see one of these worms, I've seen some that are up to 1 foot long crawling on the sea floor. And with these bright colors, you might think, wow, this is really interesting. I'm going to pick this up and take a look at it. What can happen is when you grab one of these specimens, hundreds of these little glass-like rods of the bristles break off in your skin, and it can cause blistering, and it can be very uncomfortable. And in some cases, it makes your hand feel like it's on fire, hence the name fireworm. So the fireworms are the only group of polychaetes that are known to technically to be poisonous. Fireworms are also commonly found in marine aquaria because people bring in coral or rocks, and a lot of times these fireworms are living in those rocks, and they do very well in marine aquaria. In today's tour, I've talked a little bit about the incredible diversity of body forms, shapes, and sizes that you can find of polychaetes, as well as the variety of ways that polychaetes collect their food, as well as how they can have protection from the environment and from hopefully not getting eaten by other organisms. Clearly, the fact that you find polychaetes in every depth and every habitat in the world's oceans really does indicate how successful they have been in exploiting all parts of the world's oceans. Another indication of how successful polychaetes have been is the fact that they have been around for such a long time. In fact, the oldest polychaete fossils that are known extend back to the Cambrian, over 500 million years ago. So it's a clear indication that polychaetes have been a very, very successful group. I'll finish up our tour today. I just wanted to show you several polychaete fossils that we have here in the collection. What is amazing, these are specimens from Illinois. These are polychaetes that lived during the Pennsylvanian period in the Paleozoic. So these are fossils that are about 325 million years old. What is interesting is that most of these polychaete fossils are actually members of families of polychaetes that exist today. For example, here, this specimen, you see the little dark areas right there and there. Those are the pair of jaws of that specimen. And here, the two halves here of this rock show this specimen, and you can see the white and dark area up there. Those are the 5 pairs of jaws. And you'll notice that you can see the individual body segments, and if you were to look closely with the microscope, you would see the impressions of the bristles on each of these segments. Another example, this is a clam from the Cretaceous, so it's over 60 million years old. This is from North Texas, and you'll notice the worm tubes attached to the surface of the clam. And here you see a group of tubes that were attached on the skeleton of a sea urchin. These are tubes of polychaetes very similar to the polychaetes that are in existence today that form calcareous tubes, similar to what I showed you here earlier. So polychaetes have been a remarkably successful group, both in the past and in the present. As I've said before, they are extremely important ecological players in all the world's oceans, and for that reason, it's important that natural history museums keep collections of these specimens so that we can study them to better understand the marine realm, both past, present, and extending into the future to help to keep our ocean resources. Thank you for being here today, and I hope you've enjoyed this little virtual tour of the Polychaete collection and had the opportunity to learn a little bit about a group of animals that most people don't even know exist. Thanks much. Bye-bye.